Hi, this is David Douglas, Managing Director of EBO, the digital agency. EBO are the proud sponsors this year of RadioMoLI and Molly's digital programme.
Every Life is Many Days, a podcast about James Joyce and his family in the contemporary novel. I'm Anne Fogarty from the School of English, Drama and Film at UCD. As Director of the UCD James Joyce Research Centre, it is my pleasure to collaborate with Molly on this series of podcasts exploring how James Joyce and his family have been represented in the contemporary novel. 2022 marks the centenary of the publication of Ulysses on the 2nd of February 1922 by Shakespeare and Company in Paris. Inevitably, much attention will centre on Ulysses this year, but the centenary also provides an opportunity to reconsider Joyce's legacy and to think about how we view him both as a person and as a literary icon. The many gaps between Joyce the man and Joyce the writer have in recent years been movingly explored in a number of novels that think about his life in very different ways. This series features the work of 5 authors who have woven Joyce and his family into their novels: Anna Vaught, Nuala O'Connor, Frank McGuinness, Mary Costello, and Mary Morrissey. In conversation with them, we will discuss many aspects of Joyce's influence on the modern novel. We'll examine the much mythologized but often unremembered aspects of the lives of his partner, Nora Barnacle, and Lucia Joyce and Georgia Joyce, Joyce's son and daughter. These podcasts explore why Joyce continues to act as such a lively source of inspiration for contemporary fiction writers. They also examine why so many writers feel the imperative to reinvent him and at the same time to query aspects of his biography. These novels re-engage with Joyce, but they also encourage us to see him differently and from unexpected angles. You're listening to Every Life is Many Days, a podcast about James Joyce and his family in the contemporary novel. It is a pleasure to introduce our guest this afternoon, Nuala O'Connor. Nuala is here to talk to us about her acclaimed 2021 novel, Nora, published in Ireland by New Ireland. Nuala O'Connor is a prolific and award-winning author who has written across the genres. She has published novels, short story collections, and volumes of poetry. She's worked as an arts administrator and translator and frequently teaches creative writing. Her novels include You from 2010, The Closet of Savage Mementos, published in 2014, Miss Emily, which appeared in 2015, and Becoming Belle from 2018. Her short story collections include Nude and Joyride to Jupiter, which appeared in 2009 and 2017, respectively. Nuala, welcome, and congratulations on the achievement of your novel, Nora, which we'll be delving into. It, of course, has won many accolades and has won over a very enthusiastic readership, I know. But, of course, foremost amongst the accolades is being chosen as the One Dublin, One Book title for 2022. So I'd like to begin by just approaching the novel generally. Can you give a short description of the novel for those who may not know about it yet?
So the novel is Nora's story, Nora's point of view, her life with James Joyce. And the subtitle is a love story. I didn't choose the subtitle, my publishers did. But when you look at the whole Joyce piece and you see the love that was between Nora, Giorgio, Lucia and Joyce, Love Story seems like an appropriate title for it. So it follows Nora from when she first meets Joyce in June 1904 to her death in Zurich in 1951. So it's a good few years that I set myself the task to cover. And I wanted the reader to see that great art isn't made in isolation, it's made with supports. And in James Joyce's case, one of his main supports was Nora Barnacle.
I'd like to start off with to invite you to read from Nora.
Yeah, so I'll read the first chapter, and this is the first day they walked out together. My chapters are very short. They walked out together famously first on the 16th of June 1904. They had tried to meet 2 days earlier, but it didn't work out. Nora was probably busy at work. She worked in Finn's Hotel just there off Nassau Street. This is called Muglins. We walk along by the Liffey as far as Ringsend. The river smells like a piss pot, spilling its muck to the sea. We stop by a wall, Jim in his sailor's cap, looking like a Swede, me in my wide-brimmed straw, trying to throw the provinces off me. Out there are the Muglins Rocks, Jim says, pointing out to sea. They have the shape of a woman lying on her back. His look to me is sly, to see if I've taken his meaning. I have, and our two mouths crash together, and it's all swollen tongues and drippy spit, and our fronts pressed hard, and a tight-bunched feeling between my legs. His hands travel over my bodice and squeeze, making me gasp. "Oh, Jim," is all I can manage to say, and I step away from him. "You have no natural shame, Nora," he says, and he's coming at me now with his thing out of his trousers and in his hand, that one-eyed maneen he's no doubt very fond of. It looks, I think, like a plum dressed in a snug coat. "No natural shame," I say. "Don't be annoying me. Do you think because I'm a woman that I should feel nothing, want nothing, know nothing?" But I dip my nose to his neck for a second, the better to breathe his stale porter, lemon soap smell, span new to me. Jim squints and smiles. I kneel on the ground before him, my face before his tender maneen, glance up at him. He drops his head, the better to see my mouth close over it. The taste is of salt and heat. The feeling is thick and animal. I suck, but only for a spell, then I draw back and peck the length of it with my lips. I stand up. "There," I say, "there's a kiss as shameful as Judas's, and don't tell me it isn't exactly what you wanted, Jim Joyce." A groan. He wants that bit more, of course. But that might be enough for today, our first time to walk out together. We kiss again, and he lingers in my mouth, wanting to enjoy the taste of himself on my tongue. His paws travel over me front and back. Oh, but he's relentless. So I unbutton him, put my hand into his drawers and wrap cool fingers around his heat. A gasp. I work him slow, fast until he's pleasured, until my fist is warm and wet from him. "You've made a man of me today, Nora," Jim says, a coddled whisper, and I smile. It's rare to have a fellow say such a thing, and I feel a small bit of power rise up through me, a small bit of joy. I wipe myself with my handkerchief, and Jim fixes his clothes. I hold out my hand, and Jim takes it, and together we walk on.
Thank you. It's a brilliant opening, really startling as well, because it brings so much together, the myth of Bloomsday, which, as you say, is sort of romanticised sometimes in that short phrase, cursory phrase, the love story of James Joyce and Nora Barnacle, because there's so much more at stake. And you also establish her voice. And it's a day we know about, but we don't know as well. So it's the whole mystery of what a biographical novel can do. So I'd like just to begin with the early beginnings and ask you about what attracted you to the figure of Nora Barnacle as a subject.
I think like all these things, when you start a project like this, it's sort of a few things sort of rise up and crash together and refuse to let you not notice them. So I suppose, firstly, in my teens, I had read Brenda Maddox's biography of Nora and fell in love with Nora. Then came the beautiful film by Pat Murphy and Jerry Stembridge. Thoroughly enjoyed that. Thought Susan Lynch was an astonishing Nora. She was perfect, sensual and, you know, capable of great emotion and all of that. I had adopted a cat shortly before I started this, I had adopted a cat and called her Nora Barnacle. I live in Galway, I'm from Dublin. And then I was studying Italian by night in NUI Galway, and one of my essays was to write an essay about Joyce's time in Trieste, and I wrote one about his friendship with Italo Svevo, the Italian writer. And all the time I was doing the research for that, I was back inside my Maddox and my Elman, and I thought, wow, okay, what's Nora doing over there? I'm more interested in what Nora's doing, and it occurred to me to write a short story about her. And this sometimes happens to me. I write something short, like a poem, or a flash fiction, or a story, and then I find, okay, I'm not finished with this subject. Okay. So Nora just, whatever communion I had with her writing the story, didn't want to leave me. And I thought, could I write a novel? And of course, taking on Joyce feels audacious. It feels big. I had already taken on Emily Dickinson, and I know how protective the Dickinson scholars are and were of her. And I feared, I suppose, the same thing about Joyce. But then, once again, like these projects, once they take hold of you, there's sort of no getting away from them. You don't want to get away. You start your research and the excitement begins. And for me, that novel excitement, that first bit of excitement is really important, and it's what launches the project into reality. Yeah. And so I started to get really excited about, so the story ends when they step on the boat.
Yes.
And I started to get excited to travel with them to Zurich, Pola, Trieste, Paris, and all the rest of it, you know. And so it began from those bits of kind of things in the ether that were maybe waiting to come together to push me forward into this.
I love how you describe the evolution of your interest, because that's really communicated in the novel, just the sense of a character who gets a hold of us, that you're getting under her skin, but she gets under the skin of the reader. And progressively so, as the novel moves on, there's a kind of evolution I really felt in my interest in her as the novel grew and grew. I'd like to talk next a little bit about research. It's sort of one of those bugbear aspects of biofictions and how the factual and sources and research fit in. So a few questions here. How did you go about researching the novel? You've mentioned some things, of course, already. And then what does a writer do with research? Because it must become a burden as well at some point when you move into composing the novel and drafting it. You know, where does the research go? Or do you really just have to set it aside?
Yeah, I suppose I work differently to some other historical or biofictional writers in that I do a bit of appetite-whetting research. So I reread Nora by Maddox. And then I drip feed. So I have the arc of the story in my head. I know what it is. And then I drip feed the other research to myself as I go along. So, for example, I read a lot of the friends' testimonies, people like Marian Porrick-Collum, Frank Budgeon, the artist, who was a friend of theirs, so to see what they had to say. Obviously, I read the letters that Elman collected. I used any online resource I could find, and then a lot of biographies. So I read as many biographies as I could stomach, in a sense. But I read them as I wrote. So say I'm newly in Trieste, I write the scene as I imagine it, and then I read the research to make sure I have it right, because there is controversy about biofiction. Some people want it to be completely true, but it can't be, because biofiction is an act of embodiment, and for me, an act of empathy. I don't spend time with people that I don't like in this way, because it takes me about 2 years to write a novel. So for me, it's about, I have this theory about that there's sort of people who festoon as biofictional writers and people who are faithful, and I fall somewhere between the two. I'm quite faithful, so I'm sort of wedded to the chronology of people's lives, and I'm wedded to the facts of their lives. But I'm also in the business of providing an interior life for these characters, and so I am festooning as well. Yeah. But I tend not to. I don't go too far off piste, in the sense that I read a novel about Emily Dickinson after I had written mine, and she was out in taverns drinking. Now, I know for a fact she didn't do that, so it wouldn't be something that would interest me, you know, to have Nora do something completely out of character as I see it. I wouldn't have her go off and have an extramarital affair, because I know she didn't. She was very against that. And so I don't festoon in that way. I want to create probable, believable scenes in the novel whereby I think, how would Nora have felt about this situation? Say when Giorgio was having an affair with a married woman. Yes. Nora, by all accounts, was very annoyed about this and shunned Helen for a good while. And then Helen was let into the fold. So I had to sit and think, how would this... And Nora is a curious mix of conservative and what we'd see as maverick. By the time they were in Paris and Giorgio was having this affair, Nora and James Joyce were quite bourgeois. They were quite settled in themselves, in their 40s. They weren't going around with the lost generation having parties madly and that sort of thing. They were quite, square, I suppose. And they had quite a square Catholic reaction to Giorgio Joyce's affair. And so I sit and think about Nora and what would she have said? How would she have felt about it? Yeah. She felt maybe it reflected badly on her and Jim as parents. Maybe she was embarrassed that someone at home might find out, all of that sort of stuff. And so that's what I'm doing. I'm trying to make the scenes where someone is reacting to the things we know about.
Yes. Actually, burrowing down a little bit more into some of the things you've just said, and you've wonderfully characterised all of the different facets of biographical fictions that are exploratory, that are not fixed. And it's even said about biographies. Hermione Lee says a biographer makes up their subject and makes them over as well. So there's invention even in biography, let alone biographical fiction. But anyway, let's thinking a little bit further about how to create Nora as a fictional figure. Brenda Maddox, in the preface to her biography, has the wonderful comment that she started off liking Nora, and so she puts it in this kind of not quite lukewarm way, but matter of fact, but says she finished her biography in awe of her. And I think you bring your readers on a particular kind of journey with Nora in the novel, because of your characterization of her, and because of the way in which you give her a voice and interiorize her, precisely in the way that you were talking about just now in the ongoing arguments with Giorgio about his affair. But it's particularly the idiom that you give Nora that's striking, I think, from the word go, from that first chapter that you read for us. So how did you go about creating that voice and avoiding the risk either of overquoting, referencing Joyce, or creating a stage Irish woman or someone, a Galway girl or whatever? She needs to be something bigger than that and different to grab hold of the reader.
That's it. You have to find the tone. I think that works. And there is that stage Irishy danger. I mean, people do often sound stage Irishy. Some of my neighbours at home in Galway have this wonderful way of speaking, but when you put that on the page, it doesn't come across so well. Yes. So you have to find something that reflects reality, but that is a little bit more balanced. And then we know Nora left school at 12, was not interested in high literature, loved her penny dreadfuls and her Daily Mail. Yes. So she's not going to speak like an intellectual either. So you're trying to find a voice that might have worked. So when I started writing this, I think I was 23 years living in Galway. So I would mind the phrases of my Galway friends, particularly Galway city people. I would listen to their vocabulary and, ask them actually, so there's a phrase, Galway people say, oh, she's an awful ringer, and ask them, what does that mean? And would it have been about maybe 100 years ago? This kind of thing. Span new is a Galway phrase that means brand new, that I had never heard before I lived in Galway. And so you co-opt those things in to give authenticity. And luckily, I'm edited first in the States. My book is sold first in the States and then comes over here. My American editor was very open to all of this Hiberno English, which is not always the case with editors, but she was very open to it and didn't quiz me on it at all. She was very accepting. So that was wonderful. I didn't have to dilute the language, for some imagined audience that doesn't understand things. So that was great. I suppose, you can't really get off the ground with a piece like this until you have the tone. It's like a voice in your ear. And I love first-person narratives. I love their sort of necessary impediments. You only have one point of view. I actually find third-person point of view a little trickier. So I love this business of embodying the character, inhabiting them, and in a sense becoming them. Yeah. And then hoping that when the reader comes to it, that the story and the voice flows around the reader so much that she feels, excuse me, that she herself is Nora.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Very enjoyable, actually, as a thing to do, to embody somebody else and try and become them on the page.
Yeah, and it makes Nora distinctive, but also you get a sense of her presence and agency as well, because that distinctive voice that you give her then also colours the intimate private conversation between Jim and Nora in the novel. And you don't feel it's been imposed by Joyce the writer on her. In fact, that is emanating much more from her to him, the goose scene, which you use wonderfully, their endearments to each other, but also how they quarrel with each other in the course of the novel, that she colours his language as much as he's creating her as a character or whatever.
Yeah, because what a thrill for him to come across this exotic Galway woman with this mouthful of stories that and of course, you know, my voice for Nora is partly based on Molly Bloom's soliloquies and Nora's own letters, which are punctuation free and where she's quite self-effacing and funny when you read her own letters. There's not a lot of them extant. But yeah, so the voice is based on all those different things, and then you kind of take it to yourself. I didn't want her to sound too much like Molly Bloom.
Yes.
Though I love a lot of Molly's expressions, because then she'd be like a pastiche or something. And Joyce himself admitted Molly is an amalgam of people. She's not one person. Though I am absolutely sure a lot of her phrases are Nora's, you know. Molly's obsession with comparing people she doesn't like to cabbages, you know. She says Boylan wouldn't know poetry from a cabbage. And then I think it's Josie, she says the white owl cabbage head of hair on her or something like that, you know. So I'd say a lot of what Joyce used for that and in Exiles and stuff like that is based on Nora.
Yes, yes. I'd like to talk to you next about the structure of the story, the overall structure, as well as the way in which you modulate the chapters, which I think is very particular. At what point in composition did you decide on the arc of the narrative? You more or less give us Nora's full life, so it's not a cross-section of her life. Then you modulate the chapters as the novel goes on and devote more and less time to different phases of their life, which endows the novel, I think, with a very particular rhythm. There are shorter chapters followed by longer, more immersive ones. So you move in and out of some kind of fluctuating set of circumstances, because I think a lot of the novel actually is about conflict. It's not at all static. It keeps us moving and thinking, wondering about Nora as a figure, not at all presuming, oh no, I know what she's about or anything like that. The puzzles remain to the very end. So first, the arc of the story.
Yeah, so I suppose I wanted to follow the chronology, and then I had envisioned it as writing it as a novel in flash fiction. So discrete pieces. So each chapter I wanted to be able to stand alone. And then this was my initial idea. In fact, I wanted to write a novella, which is ludicrous when you think about it now. But that idea fell away quite quickly because I realised pieces of this are larger than other pieces. So Trieste is an enormous piece. That was their foundation and their forming. Yes. It was where their love cemented itself, and it was also where the children were born, where they became parents, where he realised fully he wanted to be the whole artist, that teaching outside of, you know, art was not of interest to him. Earning money outside of art from teaching is what I mean. So really, I had to devote a lot of time to Trieste, and I was very happy to do that. And when my agent read a draft, she kept asking me as I was writing, where are you now? And she was dying for me to get to Paris because, you know, I think she thought that, oh, well, there they will be with the Hemingways and the, you know, whoever, Gertrude Steins and all these people. But for me, it was important to keep them in Trieste and write that fully. You know, so that the person sees how they grew as a couple, how poverty affected them, how Stanny was such...
I completely agree, yes. And Pola, Trieste and little bits of Zurich, because those cities are less known to people. Joyceans, of course, know of them and a little about them, but not enough. So it is a much more enigmatic aspect of them coming together. And it's the beginnings of the whole story as well.
And a way, the most interesting part, because he's not famous then, and so they're kind of left alone. And then fame brings its problems and money brings its problems to them. Because
and the children are born. She's becoming a mother during that phase as well, learning Italian, everything is happening.
Exactly, yeah. And then I suppose structure-wise, you don't want to linger too long over parts that you feel are... Like, I had a lot of stuff in that was subsequently taken out by my editor. So I did have the whole piece where he put Nora in the Sing play in Zurich and all of that. But it was felt it wasn't moving them along quick enough. And so certain things have to come out.
Yes.
You know, so... But yeah, structure is something I enjoy. I like short chapters as a reader and I like them as a writer. And I think they give the reader a break where they can breathe and think. You know, much the way you consume a short story, I think I like my chapters to be consumed like that.
Yeah, it's a very distinctive facet of reading the novel. So I think the rhythm does indeed work very well. I'd just next like to ask you to talk about the other biofictions that you've written, which are quite different and obviously very different subjects as well. The Miss Emily novel, which looks at Emily Dickinson, but from an oblique point of view through an Irish maidservant in her house, and Becoming Belle, which tells a very different story of an Irish artiste, a vaudeville performer, and her rise to fame and the difficulties with her marriage. So two very different scenarios. And then we now have Nora from you alongside those two novels. Did all three novels present you with certain different kinds of predicaments that you needed to resolve, as it were, as an author of these biographical novels?
Yeah, so I didn't want to write a straight Emily Dickinson novel, and it suited my purposes to bring an Irish maid in. Emily had Irish maids, 3 that we know of. And so I invented a maid because I had written a book about a German artist and it had not gotten off the ground for me in the way that I wanted it to. I think I over-researched it. I was too wedded to the facts. So I thought, let me give myself a solid fictional element to this Emily Dickinson novel so that I have some freedoms. And so the Emily parts, it's really set in 1866, which is a kind of a year that, it was the year she really retreated from the world, took on wearing the white wrapper, and, you know, was writing in earnest because she had time, because she wasn't out and about socialising and what have you. And so they didn't have a maid that year, as it happened. And so I could easily slot my Ada Concannon in there into the Dickinson household and have her do the work. So that one's a dual narrative. One chapter is in Emily's voice, one is in Ada's voice. So again, you have chiming voices, and it's to show how, again, so-called extraordinary people like James Joyce and Emily Dickinson have no aversion to ordinary people. In fact, they value them highly. And so that novel is about cross-generational friendship. Emily's 36. She would be considered an old maid at that point in that time. And Ada is fresh off the boat from Ireland, a willing emigrant. She's 18 or 19, I think, when she lands in the house. And so they have this lovely kitchen friendship because Emily Dickinson was a baker. And that was my way into the book, actually. I like baking, and so I started baking Emily's recipes and always loved her poetry because I was a teenage goth. So we always loved Emily's work. And so, yeah, all these things just kind of come together and push you into doing something. Yeah. And then Belle, obviously very different. Yeah. Because she's not well known outside of maybe London theatre circles. Maybe she might be a little bit known. She married into the Irish aristocracy, and then that aristocratic family basically fell and left Ireland. Now, the aristocracy was doomed at that point anyway in Ireland, but it was seen as a very bad marriage by the sitting Earl. His son, the Viscount, made this, improbable marriage that he disapproved of. And so essentially it's a court case novel. It's about how the father tries to get between the son and the wife and fails. Enormously enjoyable to research and lots of freedom because there isn't a great paper trail apart from the court case. Yeah. So I had a lot of freedom there to invent what Belle might have been feeling about her situation. There was always the accusation that she was a gold digger. She was an unwed mother who marries this aristocrat. In actual fact, they went on to have 5 or 6 more children and had a very happy marriage until her early death. So the marriage worked out. The Clancartys in Ireland did not.
Yeah. Yeah, you paint a fascinating picture of the different constraints and then opportunities that different subjects put forward for you as an author. I'd like to move next to the subtitle that you mentioned that you didn't choose for your novel, A Love Story of Nora Barnacle and James Joyce. I think Brenda Maddox's biography also had a similar kind of subtitle imposed on it, not chosen by her.
It was something like The Real Story of Molly Bloom or something like that. Or the
it's
story
almost like publishers want to copper fasten something.
Oh, that's it. They had to get James Joyce shoehorned into my title somehow. So that was how they did it. Yeah.
But of course, this is a love story. It's a story of passion, as is self-evident from the first chapter. But it's much more complicated than that. And I think what you draw out, one of the things you draw out for me most fully in the novel is the everyday strife and tension, quarrels, all the predicaments from Nora's point of view. In all the phases of their life, it's unrelenting, but especially in the early years, those years that you mentioned that you concentrate on Trieste. I guess one of the kind of takes on Nora and James Joyce as a couple is that they're complementary, that they're opposites, and that this tension or conflict between them was sort of predestined always to happen. And each of them at various moments did think of leaving the other. And in a way, I think people looking at it from the outside console themselves with this idea of an enduring romance. So where do you think the truth lies, or can we ever know?
Yeah, I think it's somewhere in between. I mean, every marriage is full of compromises. And I think Nora had firmly made her bed when she left Ireland eloping with James Joyce, unmarried. And then very quickly became pregnant with her first child. Yeah. And so they left Ireland to escape the constraints of ordinary life and ended up in a very ordinary life, in a sense, in Trieste, where the father goes out to work to earn the money and the mother stays at home minding the children and, as it happens, taking in laundry in Nora's case. I think they were each other's yin and yang. She was a very naturally optimistic, pragmatic, down-to-earth person, but also a sort of an Edwardian maverick. You know, she would have been expected, if she was going to emigrate, to go to England or to America. Yeah. She would have been expected to marry a practicing Catholic and have a lot of babies. So she did what was not expected of her by going to Europe, by being with this very educated man, though Nora liked educated men. The boyfriends we know that she had were all school teachers, university students and that. Yeah, so she wasn't averse to an educated tone when she heard one. I'm sure she was as delighted as he was on Nassau Street that day when they met each other. So Joyce really was this sort of tender, empathic, sensitive, nervy, tricky individual. And she was this optimistic, naturally good-humoured person, which must be a lovely way to walk through life. And they were a lovely complement to each other. So also the marriage strikes me as very Irish in a way. Yes. That there was a lot of... she would scold him, and she did it in front of people, which alarmed sometimes their American friends in Paris. They didn't quite understand, but it's actually a very Irish way to conduct a marriage, you know. Yeah. And I love that about them. Stanley, his brother, criticised Nora, and Joyce jumped to her defence and said, there's more nobility in her than there is in me. You know, don't be so quick to downgrade her because of her being working class and uneducated, in the sense that most Irish people were uneducated, that they left school.
Do you think there was a class divide between Joyce?
Yeah, I mean, his family were the middle classes, the fallen genteel as such. They were living in absolute squalor and dire poverty by the end. Their father was really incompetent as a father and as a provider. And passed on some of those traits to James, even though he disdained that kind of behaviour. He almost became his father with the heavy drinking and the endless moving house, which is very disruptive for a family. Nora had been brought up by her granny. She was fostered out, a very common custom, as we know, in Ireland, and had quite a nice life with her granny. Her 7 siblings were at home in a small house, a 1-bedroom house with her mother. So, she was definitely from the working classes. Her father was a baker. He lost his bakery through drink. So they'd stuff in common. They had drinking fathers. They were both from port towns. They were city people, and it's no wonder they went to Trieste in the end, or ended up in Trieste in the end, and Paris after that. Though Nora did want to try London, I think probably because it was English speaking, and she might have found more comfort in that.
Yeah.
They were changing language all the time, let's not forget.
Actually, that leads me to the next question I wanted to ask, in that you really underscore just the poignancy of her situation, that, okay, she goes away with Joyce, and in fact, she almost instigates that move more than he does to begin with. But she's absolutely at his mercy. She's isolated with him when they get to Trieste, and it's a continuing aspect of her life all the way through into the Paris years, trying to find, trying to locate people she can talk to who are her friends, not his, and part of the literary circles around him. But particularly in the Pola Trieste years, you really draw out how alone she is. Or when they're in Rome, she sits on the rooftop with the baby Giorgio, just looking at the roofs of Paris. Joyce has these long working days, so she hardly sees him. So just the isolation of this woman is
that's
really
from fact.
brought home.
Yeah, that's from fact. She did actually really suffer from loneliness. He had very long hours in Rome. He was gone like for 10 hours a day or something working. A lot of what I put into Joyce's mouth actually comes from things he said in letters.
Yes.
Thank goodness he was a great letter writer, and he wrote to Stanny, who was really his whetstone and his sounding board and his money provider. Poor Stanny. I hate saying poor Stanny, but poor Stanny. So a lot of the stuff that Joyce says comes from him. So a lot of what happens is actually very factual, but as I said, I weave it into scenes. She was very lonely in Rome. And I think a lot of women at that time, I'll talk about Irish women because they're the ones I know about.
That was precisely the point I was going to make. It really gives us an insight into coupledom and marriage in the period, and how the dynamics worked, because just women got abandoned in these relations, and Joyce keeps drinking night after night, leaves her at home. Of course, they socialise a lot together as well.
Yeah, the bargain that she entered into, she probably knew what it was.
Yeah.
She maybe didn't know he drank quite as much as he ended up drinking. And isn't it awful really that he did that to her, having witnessed his father do it to his mother and having really hated it, and tried very hard to escape it, and did escape it. To repeat that seems like an awful insult to her.
Yeah, it seems to have been just part of an untamable, anarchic part of him. Moving on next to the way in which Nora changes, though, as well, that she goes abroad, as you say already, as this very strong-minded, positive young girl, but yet she does have to change, learn different languages, immerse herself in different cultures. Elman has this very nice comment about Joyce after he wrote his historic letter to Henrik Ibsen, the Norwegian playwright, that beforehand Joyce was an Irishman and after he was European. It's a very kind of male assessment, though, of how you become something. It's like it's an instantaneous entitlement. It can just come about like that. But you show how Nora learns to be European as well, how she changes in many different ways. So I'd just like next to ask you about that aspect of Nora, her metamorphosis. You talk about later about Joyce and Nora being very bourgeois figures in London, but they also take on other aspects of Europeanness.
Yeah, and I thought that was depicted beautifully in Pat Murphy's film, when we see Nora come back to Galway and she's wearing this white outfit and this enormous hat. They were great. They loved style, the two of them. And when they did start getting money from the likes of Harriet Weaver, they did spend a lot on clothing. And you can see it in the children as well. They were impeccably dressed always.
Yes.
And that beautiful visual representation of it coming into kind of cold, dark, rainy Galway. There's this woman with this enormous, European look about her, which was very deliberate because they were very conscious of their clothes. And you find that in their letters and stuff, that they didn't like looking shabby, they liked looking smart. So I wanted to bring that into the novel as well, that by the time Nora did come back to visit Galway, they came for an extended holiday in 1912, she had become a very, very different person to the person she was. She was now bilingual. She spoke Italian at home with her family. She dressed for the climate that she now lived in, which was the absolute opposite to dark, rainy Galway. It was bright, sunny Trieste. Her food even. So it took them a while to get used to the food in Italy, well, Austria as it was, Austro-Hungary. But then, of course, your tastes become that. But then her children, when they came to Galway, refused to eat her mother's food, which was terribly embarrassing. And Nora had to bring them to a cafe every day to eat. And then they started saying, we don't want to go into the house, it smells of cabbage. And, you know, she sort of must have realised these children have very bad manners and are not Irish in the sense that I was Irish, you know. So, yeah, it's an interesting metamorphosis to watch, you know, and you can't go through every minute of their time in Trieste. But obviously the people they're dealing with, their friends are Italian, their friends are from England, they're from different places. There's a German woman working with Jim as well. So they have this suddenly cosmopolitan set. The unfortunate thing for them is because Jim insists on moving and following his sort of trail of ambition, that their friend group changes very often. His other problem is he sees everybody as a potential betrayer, and if they don't betray him, he'll find a reason to say that they did, including Beach, Weaver, all of these people who were so incredibly generous to this family as a foursome. Joyce found ways to be cranky with them or fall out with them or whatever, you know. He did come back around often and praised people like Beach, but he did manage to get cranky with her over perceived royalties that weren't given to him, even though ridiculously he had 66% of the profits of Ulysses, and used the till at Shakespeare and Co. as a kind of a, I don't know, petty cash box.
Yeah. There were similar issues with Harriet Weaver, so tensions always entered into the close relations that he had.
Honestly, the woman gave them the equivalent of 1.5 million euro in today's money.
Yes.
Inheritance that she got straight to Joyce.
She's a remarkable figure.
And minded Lucia for them when Lucia was ill.
Yeah, continuously until the very end of her life. Moving on to another subject matter that is central, of course, if people know Ulysses and know about Joyce's life. Joyce is a revolutionary writer for all kinds of reasons. He reinvents the short story form, the novel form, but he's also revolutionary because of his subject matter. And in fact, that was how he was received in the first instance. Ulysses was seen as this scandalous novel, pornographic and so on. So as an author broaching the life of Nora and James Joyce, you can't avoid the topic of sexuality. We know it's central. This is not just a love story and a romance. It's a very sexual, passionate relationship. And you breach these taboos yourself from your very daring opening chapter, supplying some of that information that we surmise about the first date or the first very long date that Nora and Joyce have together. And another scandalous aspect of the exchange between Nora and Joyce, but her letters, of course, are lost, are the so-called dirty letters from 1909, which go out of another betrayal, a dispute between them, which hinges on jealousy. Nora's former lovers, all of whom Joyce keeps rehearsing in his mind and bringing back to life again. And the letters make for very uncomfortable reading. They were sort of censored or at least held back by Richard Ellman for a good bit because of their sadomasochistic elements. You brilliantly supply Nora's letters that we don't know, but you also take us through all of the ups and downs of that very stormy summer and the exchanges and breakdowns in communication between them. So could you comment a little further on that? Because you're entering into very uncomfortable territory here. Interesting, of course, but it moves us away from any kind of easy romanticised view of Nora and James Joyce as a couple.
Yeah, I think the erotic letters and all of the stuff that's gathered around that is something you can't ignore when you write a book like this. And I was absolutely determined to get them in. I had a lot more of them in, and I actually rewrote Joyce's because I was worried about copyright stuff.
Yes.
Stephen Joyce was still alive at the time, and I know the letters were first published in, I think, 1975. So I was worried about copyright. So
Yes.
I really very closely mimicked his letters, but you can read the real ones online anyway. And then I used his as a sort of a call and response guide to compose Nora's, to imagine what she might have been saying to him,
Yes.
to incite some of the stuff.
Yeah.
Now, I think the coprophilic stuff was Joyce's own predilection, and I'm not sure that Nora was too enamoured of it. Like when he asked her to defecate in front of him, which she complied with, she then couldn't look him in the eye. She was so ashamed. And he says that in one of the letters to her. We obviously should never have been able to read these letters. I
Exactly,
can
yeah.
totally understand Stephen Joyce's and any of the other relatives' annoyance about this.
Yeah.
Who would want to read these kind of letters belonging to someone so closely related to them? It's but when they're there, you literally can't ignore them.
And at the same time, it's somehow in keeping with everything we know about Joyce as a writer and indeed as a person. There were no taboos for him. He wrote roughshod over everything, religion, political beliefs, sexual ones, friendships. He was going to query every aspect of life. So I suppose in some ways they do fit into this very uncomfortable story of these two people. And you, of course, show how it is a very tricky set of negotiations, that she's in a way complying with what he wants from her, writes back to make it up in the language that he has sort of imposed on her, but disputes it as well. So she's not just taking it all on board.
Well, that's the thing as well, though, isn't it? Like, I mean, sex is just part of life. John Quinn said about Portrait, his book is just life. And you could say the same of Ulysses. It's life. It's how do you live a life? What is important in a life? What are the elements we're all obsessed with? And for me, and this is, well, obviously there was no sex in Emily Dickinson, but I mean, all of the books I write and my short stories as well, I don't shy away from the sensuous aspects because they're such a huge part of our lives. And I don't see, there's no reason nowadays in fiction not to include them. We can, and so therefore we should. I mean, Ulysses went through such a terrible trajectory of trying to be published, with all of the stuff in the States and the UK.
Nonetheless, I think it still takes courage to take all this on board and to broach it once again as an author yourself who brings other interests and different value systems to the story of Nora and Joyce. I'd like to talk next about the portrait of Joyce that emerges in the course of the novel. Of course, he's central, but not. This is the story of Nora, as you said at the very beginning. And Maggie O'Farrell in The Wonderful Hamnet makes the unusual decision of not quite sidelining Shakespeare, but he always remains shadowy, not quite named, and just moves in a kind of ghostly fashion in and out of the narrative. You don't do that. So, in fact, you make things even more difficult for yourself because Joyce is looked at, we see him from the point of view of Nora, but he talks in propria persona as well. So he speaks in the first person. So we've different facets of Joyce being bounced off against each other, and we're always trying to make up our minds about him as a figure and a character as well. So what's your take on him as a figure?
So when I started, I didn't want him to overshadow it. The whole point of this was to stop having Nora as sort of a page blot or a side smudge to the Joyce,
Yes.
To bring her forward and show how important she was to him getting the work done. And for Nora, he is the father of her children. He's her life partner. He's the person that earns the money. And so he has to be there. They hardly ever were apart from each other. And as we see, when they were apart from each other, they corresponded hugely. There could be 2 letters a day. And so there isn't a way to write about Nora, in a sense, and not have Jim fully present. I had several scenes, in fact, where Nora was on her own. So I had one shopping scene where she goes shopping in Trieste by herself and has an encounter. And then I had another scene where she was up on the Carso with Lucia as a baby, strapped to her. She goes walking by herself. And interesting, my editor cut both those scenes. And I kind of tried to fight for them and say, well, I think it's important to see Nora by herself, having agency, doing things alone, passing the Bechdel test where she's not always in conversation with Jim or some other man.
Yeah.
But no, it was felt that they weren't moving the narrative along. I felt that they added power to her as an individual doing her own thing, which she often did, obviously, because he was out either working during the day when they're in Trieste and drinking at night with sailors and so on.
I'm just going to read a comment. This is Nora's interiorized thoughts about Joyce late in the novel. Jim Joyce is my love, but he's also a bother to my heart and a sore conundrum to my mind. I don't think the day will come when he'll grow to be the man he should be.
And I think maybe someone who has problems with alcohol, and he definitely, someone who drinks every single day has a problem with alcohol. You know, he used it to be gregarious. He used it as maybe a what would you say, a gramophone horn or something. He used it to be able to socialise because he found people tricky. We know all of this. So to be married to someone like that must be really, really difficult. And she had to put up with that, you know, right to the end, you know, and to watch him, in a sense, not take heed of the doctors when it came to drinking, that it was hurting both his stomach and his eyes, which were his two great sites of pain. And he was in dreadful pain a lot of the time. And she nursed him through that. She clearly had the patience of 10 saints. She really was extraordinary, had some sort of extraordinary inner strength that kept her. And obviously love, you know, obviously great regard for him, not as Joyce, the famous and wonderful writer that we all revere, but Joyce, the man.
Yes. That's really what you do, communicate. You've spoken very eloquently, I think, at the launch of Nora, the virtual launch here in Molly, about the fact that Nora really doesn't take on the role of the literary wife, or a lady of letters is the phrase that she uses about Harriet Weaver in the novel. And could you comment a bit more about that?
Yes, so I feel Nora was resolutely herself. She was not into literature. She liked what she liked. And Kyberd said about Molly Bloom, she wasn't easily mastered by outside forces. And I think you could say the exact same of Nora. When Jim did try and get her to write the letters, he was frustrated with her lack of capitalisation and full stops and the whole lot. And it was a project not worth pursuing. She didn't want to do it. She didn't have skills in that direction. Her skills were where she had them, and she knew that as his, you know, constant companion, minder, feeder, the person who dragged him home from the bistro when he had drank too much. There's accounts of her shoving him into taxis and him screaming, "Will I ever be free of this?" You know, like drunk out of his head. So she didn't see the need to be that person. But also James Joyce was a person who was a great man for delegating and recruiting helpers. And so when the children were old enough, they were often sent on errands to Shakespeare & Co. and what have you. He had Helen Fleischman, Giorgio's wife, typing for him. Anyone he knew who he thought he could do something for him, he would have them do it. And he just knew, obviously from experience, that Nora was not the person to do that. And actually some of the expat American literary crew in Paris sort of disdained Nora for this. They didn't see why she wasn't like some sort of Vera Nabokov figure who was doing all the stuff in the background. They wanted her to be that, and she most certainly wasn't. I think there was often cultural misunderstanding about the Joyces and the way they conducted their marriage from the Americans. And they would have seen that was her duty, whereas she didn't see it as that at all. She knew what she was and who she was, and that it worked for them.
Another problematic facet of the life of the Joyces, but particularly Nora herself, is her relationship with Lucia, her daughter, and Lucia's mental health problems, and how they skew and colour Nora's relationship with Lucia. Often biographical summations of Nora are quite judgmental and moralistic on that score. Nora is just simply seen as a bad mother who somehow failed Lucia. You bring out the complexity of the relationship, again, very much through the interiorized view of Nora, but bouncing it off, of course, the very spiky character of Lucia, this obstreperous, unmanageable daughter who's such a tragic figure, as well as an independent and important figure in her own right.
Yeah, and I think it is very complex. So Lucia was diagnosed with several things, but one of the things was hebephrenic schizophrenia, which is characterised by emotionless behaviour, incongruous and silly behaviour, and we've evidence of Lucia acting in all of these ways. She also had catatonia, she suffered from hallucinations. and deterioration of intellect is another facet of that. She was violent. She was prone to truancy. She was sexually promiscuous. So Nora had her care mostly because Jim was writing or drinking. And this was not an easy person to deal with. So as parents, they were extremely worried. They were worried about Lucia herself and being a danger to herself. Joyce was a bit worried about his reputation, particularly when Lucia was at home in Bray with her cousins, that people would say, oh, Joyce's daughter is mad, and it would reflect badly on him. Giorgio was the first person to actually commit Lucia, so he started a chain of committals and uses of the, what do you call that thing, the straitjacket. Yes. But Lucia would set fires, for example, in the house in Bray. She would paint the rooms black. She would naked sea swim. Like, this is the 1920s. This was all highly unusual, provocative behaviour. Lived on a diet, of champagne, cigarettes and fruit. So she was pretty out of control. And for Nora to try and deal with that and to try and accept that this, to try and parse out, was this just bad behaviour or was there something wrong with her? And Nora came to the conclusion that there was something wrong with her. There was mental illness in her own family. Her sister Dilly was incarcerated in Ballinasloe in the asylum there for a while. And there was mental illness on Joyce's side as well. And I suppose there is this thing that people think it runs in families. Regardless of any of that, Lucia was not well and she was a danger to herself. And what does a mother do? A mother who loves her child, and she did love her child, she tries to help her. Joyce insisted on bringing her around 20 different doctors, and from Switzerland to France to England to Ireland, obviously not wanting to believe that Lucia was as ill as she was, and hoping somehow for a cure. When it became clear, I think, to everyone around him, and he says this in a letter, everyone else says she's mad, but he was still holding out. So I think there was a lot of anxiety, sadness, fear around that, but I refuse to accept this villainous portrait of Nora. I don't find the evidence of it in anything really, apart from her impatience at times with her. Yes. Again, a very Irish mother's solution to a child that's acting up is to smack them or tell them that they're driving them mad or whatever. Again, maybe there were cultural differences there, that people were viewing Nora's motherhood through the lens of maybe wealthy people's mothering, or very educated people's mothering, or people who had a lot of servants mothering her, I think, as in, we were talking earlier about the differences between fiction, biofiction, biography. To be honest, all of this is filtered to us in different ways. Yeah. We come at it with our own biases and flavours. And so who's to know what the truth is? I think she was sick and she needed help. And eventually she got that help. And it was just very unfortunate that she remained incarcerated in the way she did for the rest of her life. Yeah.
I'd like finally to ask you about the beautiful and very affecting ending of your novel, which I suppose, unsurprisingly on one level, ends with Nora's death, but nonetheless does catch the reader, me at any rate, off balance. I defy anyone not to be affected by the ending and to cry. Nora's on her deathbed in April 1951 in Zurich, and she hallucinates Joyce. And there is a kind of interior monologue, very reminiscent of the ending of The Dead and Anna Livia flowing out to sea at the end of Finnegan's Wake as well. But you create a wonderful interweave of different points of view and different words from Nora, from Joyce, from you, Nuala O'Connor, the author as well. Despite the fact that she's dying, it seems a happy ending. I hold out my hand and Jim takes it. I rush into his arms and feel the smother of his love. My only one, my Jim. Together we walk on.
She loved him so much to the end. When he was being lowered into his own grave in Zurich, there was a vitrine on the coffin, like a little window where the face is, which was common. And she sang out in the graveyard, "Jim, how beautiful you are." So even while he is dead and gone from her, all she can think about is how much she loves him. And then her own death, I wanted to bring them back together, because she stayed in Zurich for a few different reasons. She was crippled with arthritis. It was difficult for her to travel, which is another reason she didn't see Lucia, who was in England. She wanted to be near James' grave so she could visit it up on the hill there above Zurich. And the Irish government refused to repatriate Joyce's body when they were asked to, and she was annoyed with them. So she kind of thought, I'm not going back to Ireland. Zurich is, she said something to the effect of, Zurich is a good enough place for an old woman to be. And her son, Giorgio, was nearby, and so he could take care of her. She had a very loving relationship with Giorgio. It was a classic Irish setup of Mammy's boy and Daddy's girl. And then when I'm writing a novel like this, generally, as I'm moving towards the end, the ending will occur to me, and I jot it down, and I sort of... I remember hearing Alistair MacLeod, the great Canadian writer, saying that the ending of a story is a lighthouse toward which he travels. I don't have that generally until I'm very near the end, and then the lighthouse appears, and then I start to move towards it. And so I'm very much bringing the thing down to the end. And I do like an open, hopeful end. I don't want to leave people on a very bleak note. I think it's very unfair to the reader. And I have had a lot of comments like yours from grown men and all, that they had little weeping session at the end when she sees her Jim again and they're reunited. Like for someone like Nora, who was a kind of a bit of a Catholic and probably hung on to a lot of bits and pieces of it, which if you've been brought up Catholic, they're very hard to throw away. She may have still believed in an afterlife. And so she may have felt, well, I'll be seeing him again now whenever I go. And so it seemed to me like something she might have felt, that, well, at least I'll see Jim again. You know, no matter that I'll be gone from Giorgio and won't be able to look out for him, at least I'll see Jim, kind of, you know.
Yeah. Nuala O'Connor, thank you very much for a hugely absorbing conversation. And to remind readers, Nora is published by New Ireland. That's all for this episode of Every Life is Many Days. This podcast was produced by Benedict Schlepper-Connolly and Ian Dunphy, with Ian Dunphy on sound. For more from RadioMoLI, visit radio.moli.ie.